infrastructure assessment. What we're publishing today, in fact, is our baseline report on the UK's infrastructure as the first phase of the second assessment. The report will cover two areas: the Commission's assessment of the performance of the 6 economic infrastructure assessment sectors in our remit, and then the report also sets out our priorities for the second national infrastructure assessment. Joining me today are my fellow commissioners, Julia Prescot here at the office in London, and Bridget Rosewell online from the Midlands. And here also in London, we have James Heath, our CEO. Before I introduce the new report, just a few housekeeping notices. The event will be recorded, and by joining, you give your agreement to being captured on film, if you decide to switch your camera on, that is. There are a number of journalists present, so assume you're speaking on record if you do make any contributions. We're going to automatically mute you to avoid any audio interference. And after the presentations, we'll invite you to use the raise your hand function on Teams so that if you have a question to pose, we can see you and you can hear, so we can hear your question directly when we unmute you. So, brief background to this report. In the second half of 2023, we will publish the second National Infrastructure Assessment, a major report that we produce once a Parliament, setting out costed recommendations to government on how to prepare our national economic infrastructure for the challenges and the opportunities of the future, looking ahead over the next 10 to 30 years. These reports matter, as government is duty-bound to respond to our recommendations. In its National Infrastructure Strategy, published last November, government accepted or largely accepted around 80% of the recommendations that we set out in our first National Infrastructure Assessment. Some of those felt quite ambitious at the time of publication, but from the launch of the UK Infrastructure Bank to accelerating the proportion of renewable sources in our energy mix and ending the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, our recommendations have won broad consensus and made their way into government policy. For the second assessment, government has expanded our remit. We now include a specific objective supporting the net zero goal and a requirement for us to consider the importance of supporting biodiversity when we make our recommendations. Alongside last month's budget, it was announced that the government was lifting the ceiling on the fiscal remit within which we should price our recommendations, gone up from 1.2% of GDP to 1.3%, which could mean as much as £50 billion over the next 20-25 years. We are, of course, not starting the second assessment with a blank sheet of paper. As a body that preaches the importance of stable, long-term planning, we're keen to build iteratively on our previous work, focus on those areas that we've not considered in detail before, and where we can really add value to policy making. Today's report sets out what we propose those areas will be and outlines the big questions that we hope the next assessment will answer. This is founded in part on a State of the Nation assessment of economic infrastructure, where we've looked at each of the six sectors within our remit, analysed performance by price, quality, environmental impact, and resilience to stress. We also asked the public what they think about the infrastructure services, which areas give them the most and least confidence in terms of their readiness to face future challenges. For those with a particular sector interest, you'll find this detail in the annexes to the baseline report available on the NIA page on our website. In headline terms, we found a mixed picture. Networks performing well in some areas, but with significant work necessary in others to meet the challenges posed by climate change, environmental decline, and behavioural change. To give you a couple of examples, the energy and water sectors deliver services of reliable quality to homes and businesses with low level of interruption. The UK is catching up with international comparators on gigabit broadband, and there's a wide reach of 4G mobile in the UK, but there is further to go to avoid any places being left behind. Whilst there's been a significant shift to renewable energy in recent years, there's been limited progress so far on the transition to low-carbon heating for homes, with a stop-start approach to energy efficiency policy. Despite increased government funding, there remains a continued risk of flooding to more than 5 million properties in England, including more than 3 million at risk of surface water flooding. And flood resilience is the area commanding lowest public confidence in our social research. Whilst we've seen significant improvements in water quality over the last 20 years, serious pollution incidents from water and sewage have plateaued at an unacceptably high level. While the public are largely satisfied with national roads overall, there's wide variations on rail performance, public concern over the conditions of local roads is high, and urban transport connectivity is still poor in many places. So plenty for us to get our teeth into, but we also need an organising framework for how we articulate the future challenges and opportunities. I think these are pretty unarguable. First, how can infrastructure contribute to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050? Second, how can we ensure infrastructure is resilient to climate change and contribute to a better environment and enhance biodiversity? And third, how infrastructure can support economic growth, quality of life across the whole of the UK, and play its part in levelling up places for the long term. So those three strategic goals set the framework for the second assessment. This morning we'll flesh out with our plans for the 9 specific policy challenges that will sit under those headings. Let's turn first to our strategic themes. Net zero. Economic infrastructure sectors generate a major part of the UK's current emissions. In 2019, direct emissions from energy, transport, waste and wastewater sections accounted for at least 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. This graph shows the progress that needs to be made in key infrastructure sectors over the next 30 years, notably the complete absence of any emissions from surface water transport, buildings and electricity generation. Against the backdrop of COP26, it's worth stressing that cutting emissions is important to people. Polling conducted in June found that reducing greenhouse gases was the public's top priority for the UK's infrastructure. As others have noted, much of the progress so far on decarbonisation has happened, as we say, behind the plug. When it comes to electricity generation, the UK has indeed made some great strides, cutting emissions by around 74% over the last 30 years. But we have to go further and faster if we're going to hit net zero carbon electricity generation by 2035. Keeping a secure, flexible electricity system ready to cope with increased demands from electric vehicles in particular is a significant challenge, and it forms one of the 9 projects set out in the report. Making the maroon wedge on the graph disappear in 30 years will require massive acceleration of home heat decarbonisation. Total emissions from buildings in 2019 were around 90 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, only a 17% fall on 1990 levels. Many of these emissions arise from burning fossil fuels such as natural gas for heating. Zero carbon heat will likely require transitioning to a mix of electric heating and heat from hydrogen, alongside improving the energy efficiency of buildings. The government has recently published its heat and building strategy, which contains new commitments to support the installation of low carbon heating in homes, with the goal that no new gas boilers will be sold by 2035. But there are still major questions to be answered, including what level of insulation will be needed to efficiently operate heat pumps, whether hydrogen will be available as a core source of heat for all homes, and what that will mean for the continuing use of our gas network. The Commission will seek to answer those questions by identifying a viable pathway for heat decarbonisation. As well as transforming the existing infrastructure for electricity and heat, the UK needs brand new infrastructure to decarbonise. For example, hydrogen delivery networks to help decarbonise hard-to-electrify sectors such as heavy industry, shipping, aviation. Carbon capture and storage networks to enable low-carbon hydrogen production, electricity generation from waste incineration, to enable engineered greenhouse gas removals. We'll therefore look to assess the requirement for these types of infrastructure across the economy, set out the policy and funding framework that we recommend will be needed over the next 10 to 30 years, building on the government's own work in recent years. Now, all of that will come at a cost. We need to have an honest conversation with the public about where and how the costs of reaching net zero will fall, the investment needed to retrofit existing infrastructure and build entirely new networks, which will ultimately need to be funded both through customer bills or taxpayers. The Commission will consider further challenges in the second assessment, including the overall affordability of required investment, the distribution of costs and savings across groups in society. At the end of the day, who should pay? Let me now turn to Julia, who's going to introduce our climate resilience theme. Julia.
Hello, and thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. Put briefly, our infrastructure needs to adapt to the growing risks of extreme weather and contribute to improving our environment by enhancing biodiversity, reducing waste, and cleaning up the air and water we share with other living things. Infrastructure faces both risk to assets, not being adequately prepared for a changing climate, but also offers solutions by, for instance, protecting communities from flooding. Commentators have noted we are already beginning to see the ramifications of this, witness the disruption to travel during the summer floods earlier this year. This chart offers a high-level look over the last 20 years at various measures of service level, baselined last year. While it's only a partial picture, it suggests relatively few energy supply interruptions over time, though these can, of course, be of particularly high impact, along some spikes in sewer flooding linked to extreme weather and increased rail cancellations. But let's face it, the UK is in many cases still reliant on infrastructure built during the 19th century, including roads, railways, tunnels, water pipes and sewers. There is a lack of data on asset condition, and in some cases, deterioration is not noticed until a failure occurs, and I'm sure we've seen examples of this. Also, structural concerns. At present, as the Commission argued in its major study on resilience published last summer, decision-making frameworks can undervalue maintenance and disincentivise good asset management. So for the next assessment, we will look at how better and long-term asset management can support resilience. We will consider barriers to investment and also consider how the better use of digital technologies and data can improve the way assets are maintained. This is fundamental in terms of preparing our infrastructure for a rapidly changing future. It may not have the excitement of the new, but there can be few more important areas for the Commission to investigate than that of effective long-term asset management. And indeed, our next project on this theme has already been announced by government. Surface water flooding, which the Commission has not yet considered in detail, but has already been mentioned today, presents a risk to more than 3 million properties. And we know that climate change could increase that number. A range of organisations are currently responsible for assets that affect surface water flooding, including local authorities, drainage boards, transport authorities, and water companies. And indeed, the connected issue of combined sewer overflows, which has received much attention recently, remains a key challenge and one upon which the industry can expect to continue to receive close scrutiny. And as John said earlier, while serious pollution incidents caused by water and sewage companies decreased from 2002, they've plateaued since 2014, unacceptable level, and further action is needed to address this. So we are immediately embarking on a dedicated study on the most effective approaches for managing surface water in England. This will consider issues of planning, funding, and governance arrangements, as well as the role of data and nature-based solutions. We will publish this by November 2022. Moving on to the next assessment, it's also going to be an opportunity for us to embed fully our commitment to biodiversity and enhancing natural capital. We plan to develop a set of natural capital principles for infrastructure. These will provide guidance to developers and operators on how best to deliver environmental net gain. And for our own part, we will assess the impact of our recommendations on natural capital, as well as on greenhouse gas emissions in a transparent way. Our third challenge in this area will focus on the role of the waste sector in enabling the move to a more circular economy, one where products and materials are kept in productive use for longer, and the environmental impacts of extracting raw materials are reduced. Recycling rates have increased since 2000, with 43% of local authority collected waste in England recycled in 2019. However, rates have stagnated in recent years. Then at the second assessment, the Commission will look at ways to increase recycling rates, municipal and construction waste, deliver the infrastructure needed to achieve net zero, and increase resilience to potential future restrictions on waste export. We will also look at waste processing capacity and interdependence with other economic infrastructure sectors, including energy and water. So thank you very much, and I will now pass over to Bridget, who will introduce the levelling.
Thank you, Julia, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to look at our theme of levelling up. And this is, after all, however it's termed, the idea of addressing economic discrepancies within the UK. It's hardly a new idea. It's an objective shared across political divides, but one that will take a long time to address. The slide shows as an illustration that English cities, except London, all have productivity below the national average. And this is very different from the situation in other countries. We've all seen versions of this kind of slide before, which underlines the distance that we have to make up in order to ensure our cities are internationally competitive. So it's entirely appropriate that levelling up, to use our current shorthand for this matter, is one of our strategic themes. The Commission has made recommendations in the past to support levelling up. We've stressed the need for devolved powers and funding for cities and towns to develop locally led infrastructure strategies, which in turn form part of wider economic strategies. While infrastructure can improve productivity and make places more livable, it's not the whole solution. Factors such as skills and education also have an important role to play and therefore need to be aligned to infrastructure investment. And similarly, we have to think beyond transport interventions. Other infrastructure, such as major investments in low carbon energy infrastructure, can support levelling up by boosting local growth in some places. Across the projects we're introducing today, we intend to analyse how each of our recommendations can reduce regional differences and support improvements in national productivity. But transport is clearly an important part of that picture. Improving connectivity can improve quality of life and help address constraints to growth. With the right conditions, it can contribute to economic transformation in some particular places. Before the COVID pandemic, many major cities suffered from congestion and poor public transport connectivity, preventing goods, services and people from travelling in an efficient and sustainable way. Our social research, conducted in June, suggested people are broadly content with major road networks, but they're often less happy about the state of their local roads, with concerns regularly cited about whether they will be able to cope with future demand. Car use, after all, has already returned to levels seen before the pandemic, but in the longer term, the way people use roads and public transport could be very different. Increasing public transport capacity is one option to address congestion, either by enabling car travel to be replaced with more space-efficient buses, trams, or by producing more space on faster rail connections from places further out. It also, of course, has environmental benefits, particularly while a large proportion of the private vehicle fleet is not electric. So we will undertake an urban mobility project, exploring how the busier cities and surrounding areas would benefit from large-scale transport capacity projects or network extensions. We also want to consider the role of demand management policies, such as congestion charging, and we hope to support an evidence-based discussion of the options to open up debate and allow proper consideration of the costs and benefits of different approaches. Today's report sets out that transport connectivity, how quickly you can travel in and between built-up areas, varies hugely between places, and there isn't an obvious north-south or rural-urban divide. However, it is clear that public transport journeys are currently often slower than those by car, although places of similar sizes can exhibit quite variable results on that matter. Improving inter-urban transport can facilitate trade between cities, growing potential markets and enabling better supply chains. It can also make places more attractive to live and work in, and in the case of large investments, such as high-speed rail, facilitate investment. But technological innovation, decarbonisation and COVID-related behaviour change all mean that patterns of transport demand and ways to meet that demand may be different in the future. So our next assessment will consider how a multimodal transport strategy could help the country to plan more effectively for sustainable growth, for quality of life outcomes and the shift to net zero, moving to optimise the use of different modes. It could also help ensure major investments in national roads and rail are properly integrated for both passengers and freight. This second project under the Levelling Up banner will consider relative priorities and long-term investment needs in interurban transport, including the role of new technologies as part of a strategic surface transport plan. And on that note, I will turn to James to explain our next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. Good morning, everybody. I will just quickly cover next steps and timeline for the second assessment. But before I do, I will just quickly recap on the 9 policy challenges that commissioners have talked about, which will be the focus of the second assessment. They should be on screen, and they are just a quick run through: decarbonising power by 2035, new networks for hydrogen and CCUS, and the transition to low carbon heat in the energy space. We will look at urban transport and the role of demand management and congestion charging, and we'll also look at priorities and long-term investment needs for interurban transport. We look at surface water flooding, waste and its contribution to the circular economy. We will look at improving asset management across infrastructure sectors, which on my calculations gets us to 8. And then there's a final cross-cutting challenge that we will consider, which we haven't talked about in detail so far. And that is on the question of digital and how the better, more effective use of digital technologies and use of data can help to transform all the other infrastructure sectors in our remit. We sort of know that the widespread use of data can reduce costs, it can improve resilience, and it can enable sort of better demand management across a range of infrastructure sectors. But the diffusion of those technologies and that data is still patchy across infrastructure. So in the second assessment, we're going to look at what may be holding that back and what measures may be required to accelerate adoption. So in terms of timeline, and again, you should see a slide on your screen, the baseline report we're publishing today is effectively phase 1 of the second assessment. Phase 2 will involve policy development and analysis across the 9 challenges, and will run from now for 18 months until mid-2023. And then the third and final part of the assessment will be, if you like, the finalisation of our policy recommendations to government. And as part of that, we will look at the impact on household bills of our recommendations in line with our economic remit. And we'll also look at the impact of our recommendations on public investment in line with our fiscal remit that John touched on earlier. And then the culmination will be a final report published and sent to government in the second half of 2023. Now, it's worth saying that some of our policy outputs will come in advance of that final report, particularly where there's a need for the Commission to make an intervention at an earlier point. I think, as Julia described earlier, our recommendations on surface water flooding, for instance, will be delivered by next November, partly in time to inform Ofwat's next pricing review. And the final thing I just want to say is that we're very keen to follow a sort of open policy-making approach during the assessment. We want to engage with a wide range of stakeholders and include a range of voices and perspectives as the work progresses. And hopefully by doing this, we can both improve our thinking, but also help to build a consensus around our recommendations, which is one of the key functions of the Commission as an independent body. The immediate next step is our call for evidence, and you'll see in the report that we're publishing today a series of questions where we're inviting views and insights from organisations, and we very much hope you'll be able to contribute. The deadline for written responses is the 4th of February 2022. Linked to the call for evidence, we're also going to be holding a programme of stakeholder events where we'll explore policy questions in more detail. They will begin in early 22 and they'll stretch out during the period of policy development that I talked about earlier, and will conclude probably around mid-2023. So the very final thing I want to say is to just express our thanks to the advisory panels that have advised on the development of this baseline report. I'm pleased to say that those panels will continue during the second assessment process to offer expert advice and to challenge our thinking. and we'll also be drawing on the advice of the Commission's design group and our young professionals panel. So that's all from us. It's now time to open the floor to your questions. Just in terms of how we're going to do this, could you please use the hands up function to signal that you want to raise a question, and we will then unmute you. And it'd be great if you also felt able to sort of switch on your cameras when you ask a question so that people watching can see your face. Okay, without further ado, I'll jump in. I see there's a question from Tony Barclay, Lord Berkeley.
Thank you for that. I hope you can see me. Well, John and colleagues, I think this is a really impressive report. Congratulations to all of you who've been involved. To me, there's some good bits in it, but there's also some very depressing bits about the lack of progress that the government has made, particularly on transport, of course, but also on some of the other things. And you'll have seen the debates we've been having in the Lords on sewage disposal and everything, which don't seem to be going in the right direction very fast. My question really is, how can you and we ensure that actually ministers listen to your report, read it, and members of Parliament actually start taking some action? Because we really do have to get this exposed of some of the things which are not happening. There's some good bits that are happening, but there's an awful lot of things that are not happening. I'll try and do my bit in the Lords and also see if we can get a meeting of the all-party infrastructure group. But there's many subsets of this which need to be done in particular by the parliamentary experts, and I hope we can do a great deal more on this. Seems to have happened in the last couple of years since you produced the last report. So anyway, congratulations, and there's work to be done, as you've said. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to John to respond.
Oh, thank you, Tony. And yes, I mean, the question of the difference between policy and action, of course, is a continuous one. We, of course, have the annual monitoring report as an opportunity to try and hold government's feet to the fire of the progress that they've made on the policy areas which they've accepted in principle, but where we would like to see faster action. I mean, I think one of the benefits of doing this report, of course, is it enables us to continue to keep the pressure on. I think everybody on the call today has a role in this respect, because so many people on the call today have the opportunity to speak publicly. They speak at conferences that, like yourselves, you have the opportunity to speak in Westminster. And I think it is by all of us maintaining the messages, maintaining the pressure on government to have real action plans which can be brought forward. I mean, inevitably, I think some of the most difficult areas, of course, are the ones which have been slowest. The classic is probably the challenge of domestic heating and the need for people to spend their own money largely to actually prepare their homes for the future, to minimise that. And I think it's where we get into these very tricky areas as I mentioned at the end, who pays and how the money is split between general taxation and the consumer, that some of these issues do get bogged down, in a sense, in the reality of the politics. But I mean, I think so far so good, but I don't disagree with you. There's always room for improvement, and together, hopefully, we can maintain the pressure. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I will turn to the next question from Trevor Loveday. Trevor. Trevor, are you there? Are you unmuted?
Sorry, I wasn't unmuted. Yes, I was just saying good morning, and thank you all for a refreshingly clear report. I've got really an observation more than a question, which is I was a little surprised to see what seems to be a complete absence of any sort of mention of consumer behaviour across the piece. And I'm coming at this from the water industry with the water report, of course, but where there are obvious issues there, but they have similar stories, I think, across energy as well. And I just really would like to hear some comments about that, about consumer behaviour.
I may bring John in, but then also Bridget as well.
I mean, as I was just concluding, answering Tony's point, I mean, consumer behaviour, the politics of consumer behaviour are right at the centre of so much of this, and getting that right, finding the right incentives, if you like, to change consumer behaviour, I agree, is critical. It's something which, in a sense, of course, we try to pick up in our in the discussions we have and the open forums we have with members of the public to understand how they see things, what they see as being important. But yeah, I mean, consumer behaviour is absolutely central to so much of this, and of course we've, some of the behaviours consequential on COVID. We're still not certain about how those are going to run out in the longer term. But I don't disagree with your point, and I think it does. It is always part of our thinking. I mean, we have to be careful that we don't just sort of tread on the toes of government in recommending new taxes and so on, which of course is one way of incentivising consumer behaviour. But getting that balance right is very important. But Bridget, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Trevor, for the question. I suppose there's several aspects to this, and we'll be trying to look at all of them. So, for example, there's a question of consumer attitudes to different forms of change, and there's a section, in fact, in this baseline assessment, reporting on some work we did on deliberative work with consumers on their attitudes to congestion charging, for example. Notoriously an area where people or politicians think that the public will never accept anything like this. But when you begin to explore the issues with people can change their mind. So that's one aspect to it. The other aspect, of course, so there's what do people really care about? And one of the things that we do a lot of is going around and talking to people, doing workshops, going around the country and so on to actually find out what it's really like for people. But the other part of this is then to think about scenarios, because we don't know how attitudes and behaviours will, for example, respond to the end of the pandemic, if that is indeed where we've got to, and the extent to which people's behaviours will go back to what they were before, the extent to which new behaviours will become embedded. So one of the things that we've already produced a report on, but we'll continue to think about, is what can we say about changing behaviour and changing underlying behavioural choices that people are making as they see the world change around them. They themselves will make those changes. So we need to pick that up, but at the same time not be too confident about our own projections, because they could well be wrong. And we've got to look 30 years. This looks 30 years forward. How are people going to be behaving in 30 years' time? I'm not sure any of us really know.
Thanks, Bridget. I will now turn to Chris Byrne for a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, it's Chris Byrne here. I'm the political editor of the Yorkshire Post. I just had two questions, if that's okay, two relatively quick questions. The first is that the assessment's obviously coming out in 2023, but the integrated rail plan is reported, at least, to be coming out this week. So is there any concern that your findings on transport will be too late because things will already be in motion? And the second question is, I was just wondering whether the Commission has any view on whether HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail should go ahead in full with the eastern leg to Yorkshire and the new Northern Powerhouse Rail line between Manchester and Leeds via Bradford.
John.
Well, certainly the IRP coming out will actually help in terms of looking forward to 2023, because it will actually fill in some of the jigsaw around what is planned for rail transport. So I think that's the sooner the IRP comes out, the better, and it will help clearly in our deliberations. I mean, With regard to HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail, we gave government a series of recommendations in our report. They were set against different budgetary constraints, if you like, and it's the government to make its choice based on what it believes is affordable in the overall context against the different consequences and the economic benefits of different routes being different cities being connected in different ways. So, I mean, we made our report, and frankly, I think we should now wait a few days and hopefully see precisely what it is that the government concludes.
Thanks, John. I will turn to David Ralph next for a question.
Hi, yeah, morning. So I'm from the LEP in Somerset and Devon, heart of the Southwest. So first of all, one was a point about tone, which was sort of answered earlier, that I was surprised about the lack of reference to the pandemic and the changes in infrastructure behaviour. It may be too early to say, but that sort of question is partly asked. But my question really was about it feels very urban centric. So you talked a little bit about natural capital, but I didn't see any of the specific actions between now and the assessment that brings out the natural capital. So I wondered if you could articulate that, and really whether levels of productivity in rural areas are lower than some of those cities that you mentioned, and yet that didn't feature on your slide. So I just wondered whether you were sufficiently happy that your thinking was rural proofed.
Thanks, David. I'll bring in Julia on the natural capital point, and I may bring Bridget in on the geographic point.
Yes, thank you, David, for your question. I mean, I think that one of the things that we are going to be very much looking at in the second NIA is going to be natural capital, but natural capital from the perspective of infrastructure rather than natural capital in and of itself. And one of the various ways we can look at it is how we can use techniques of natural capital to actually help infrastructure in areas such as floodproofing, for example, particularly upstream. I think that's coming back to your point about rural versus urban. That's very much a rural issue. And secondly, I think we're going to be having an increasing focus now on biodiversity. We've talked about the principles that we are proposing to introduce, mostly because there are many different strands of approach, and I think in the context again of looking at infrastructure and how these impact infrastructure then will be brought together. But I think I bring those two particular aspects forward of the way that we're not only linking natural capital but also looking at it from a rural rather than urban context.
Thanks, Julia. Bridget, do you want to pick up on the geography point?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, James, and thank you for your question. I'm sitting here in rural Lincolnshire, so I'm very aware of rural challenges. But of course, one of the things that we have to really try and present is the sheer variability across different kinds of places and the different aspects of quality of life that implies. So it's not the case that everywhere is going to have the same productivity, or that leveling up is simply about having more bankers working in your local area and earning lots of money. So it's got to be a broader picture than that. And indeed, we're working along producing a report on quality of life issues, which will come out sometime in the next few months, and that will pick up on some of those trade-offs, if you like. I think it's very important to make sure that every part of the country has its own ability to connect, to specialise in areas that it has an assets in, and to earn good incomes in doing so and reach a good quality of life. So I think we'll be looking at how we pull some of those issues together. After all, this is work which is kicking off. So I don't think we've got all the answers yet as to how to make that happen over the next 30 years. But that, for me, is certainly one of the really important things, is how you enable each part of the country, all of which are really different, to make the best use of the assets that they've got, earn the incomes that they are best capable of earning, and if you like, pull their economic weight in the country as a whole.
Thanks, Bridget. I'll turn to the next questioner, Rob Gross. Rob.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Rob Gross. I'm Director of the UK Energy Research Centre. I'm also an academic at Imperial College. I've got a question about hydrogen and hydrogen for heating, which I'll contextualise by pointing to the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget and also the 10-point plan, I think both of which probably point towards a lot of the heavy lifting being done by heat pumps. And so therefore my question is, how wide open is the question regarding hydrogen for domestic heating? And also how will you approach kind of trade-offs, competing uses for hydrogen, which could be a rather, precious thing in the energy system of the future because of its ability to get into the hard to decarbonise sectors like industry. Thanks.
John.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I mean, the hydrogen question is clearly a challenge. The extent to which it is going to be suitable for widespread domestic use is, I would, from everything I hear, still an open question. The whole challenge of moving vast bulk of hydrogen around the country in the current national gas grid will create its own challenges technically, apart from anything else. We're not going to be at that point of understanding that properly and how we can produce hydrogen cost effectively, probably for another 5 years from now at least. And therefore, in the meantime, clearly it's a bit like batteries in cars and hydrogen in cars. The electric solution of heat pumps is clearly going to be going forward because it is much more straightforward. It's probably easier to install. New properties are likely to have heat pumps and so on. So, I mean, if I was a betting man at the moment, I would say that, as we are today, it looks as though heat pumps are going to be more likely to be the majority solution rather than hydrogen being the majority solution, seductive as that might be because of the relative simplicity for the homeowner. I think what is important, though, are the biggest challenges of industry and heavy industry. And how do we decarbonise steel? How do we decarbonise cement and so on? And there, I would think that's where we really need to make sure we try and make hydrogen the best solution. And therefore, getting that balance between where can hydrogen really work, so in heavy freight, in heavy industry, I think is, to me, seems to be potentially the bigger answer to this question, and not assume that it's going to be the answer to a maiden's prayer when it comes to domestic heating. But of course, the bigger question in domestic heating is how do we make more efficient the homes that we've got? Which I think is an even bigger challenge, actually, in a strange way, that actually what do we finally finish up heating our homes with? But I don't think I disagree with the general tenor of your question at all. Thank you.
Thanks. Next question from Tom Ash.
Ask a question around green infrastructure and green space. I noticed that it was relatively little mention of access to green space in the levelling up section, despite obviously the health benefits that can accrue and the contribution to levelling up. In your final report, will you be looking at access to green space as part of levelling up and also within that green infrastructure across the country?
Bridget, I may bring you in, but also Julia as well, given it spans two of the areas.
Yeah, and thanks, Tom, for the question. I mean, I think one of the things that I'd focus on here is the way that the Commission is going to be looking at the impact, as I said, on infrastructure, on the environment. And I think it's very clear that within that, we will also be looking at issues of place, issues of social amenity, and around that as well as I've already said, the biodiversity approach. So I think green space is going to form very much part of that. I mean, clearly, just going to biodiversity for a moment, I think it's been highlighted how in order to enhance biodiversity, we need to have the capacity for green space to be created in which there's going to be increasing use and increasing how can I put it, increasing of life in terms of its own diversity within that area. So it's a key part of the second NIA, and I think, as you know, we've had two enhancements to our role, looking at both green environment issues and also and biodiversity.
Thank you, Julia. Bridget, anything to add?
I think just one thing I would add, and many of the recommendations that we have produced so far, and I'm sure that we'll continue with, are about enabling local areas to produce integrated approaches to both their infrastructure and their plans more generally for the built environment, which doesn't come directly under our remit, I have to say. So I think one of the things that I think is really important is that we continue to make sure that infrastructure is seen as part of a package, which, whether it's under our remit or not, enabling local people and local communities to make sure they've got the access and they've got the other aspects of of creating a good place to live that they need. So I think it's making that join between what we do and what communities do that's going to be really important here.
Thanks, Bridget. Next question from Mike Tredgent. Hopefully I've pronounced your surname correct, Mike.
Yes, that's fine, thank you. Yes, question about the sort of asset management side of it. There's a lot of mention of the fact that a lot of it is quite old and perhaps not as resilient. Is there any intention to create a single inventory of all sort of the major infrastructure assets and to rate that level of resilience? Two things on that. One, I think it's really important in terms of seeing the level of investment that's likely to be required, and second, to help the public evaluate those assets, because they don't necessarily see them or understand them, but it would help them to value what we have and how we use it.
Thanks, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, asset management is almost the great unknown, and it's a historical legacy. Now, clearly, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to cover the entire country with a map of where all assets are. A lot of work's been done in various sectors, either transport or water, to identify those, and that work will continue. One of the points I'd like to raise is that our focus on digital and data collection is actually going to assist us in that route. And as long as we can gather together adequate information, we can then start looking at how key these various assets are to ensuring resilience, and the way in which we can also look to finance critical parts of those assets to keep what we have going for longer. But it's an area that has been described as being somewhat unglamorous, and you're right, the public can't see it, and it's sometimes quite difficult to engage the public in the idea that it's as good to support the old rather than building the new. But it is going to be really one of our key challenges within the second NIA.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Next question from Kate Jennings. Kate.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So I had a question. I'm Kate Jennings from the Railway Industry Association. I had a question about your plans for urban mobility and multimodal transport. So will you be informed by things like the transport decarbonisation plan language on, public transport as the backbone of transport, and the rail plan language on rail as the backbone of the transport system? And then in sort of practical terms, will that mean that when you look at demand management, you look at rail fares? And then my second question, given the constraints on public finances, will you take any sort of view on more use of private funding and finance in sectors like rail and transport? Thank you.
Bridget, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, thanks, Kate. I think the answer, most of what you said is yes. We will be trying to take as a broader perspective as possible on all of these issues, recognising that the balance between public and private does vary across the different parts of the country that you're looking at, and indeed the question of whether you're moving a lot of people. And we've got some numbers about that actually in our baseline. If you've got a large number of people making a trip, heavy rail is really useful. If you've got smaller numbers, then maybe tram or bus. Walking and cycling, but walking and cycling doesn't necessarily work very well in more rural areas where you've got longer distances, or indeed it's very hilly. So there's a whole variety of solutions, and I don't think we're going to come up with, if you like, a blueprint for the whole country, but we will be trying to think about how you would use some of that information right across all the modes to think about the kind of national transport strategy that we should be thinking about. And that will include both making sure that we're maintaining our existing assets, as we just talked about, but also where there's particular bits of new investment need to take place, and then the balance between public, private, fare payers, taxpayers, and all of the debates which we all get involved with in the rail industry in particular. I'm sure those will continue.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. There's no more hands up for questions, so I may bring John in either to respond to that last point, but also to give a final remarks. No, Trevor, I think you've already had a question. I can probably squeeze you in again.
Thank you. A quick one. It's a water-specific one. One of the things that I think I'm quite surprised about is the low profile of drainage issues in infrastructure thinking. It can address a number of major issues in one blow, so to speak, in that, we are looking at addressing the combined sewer overflow issue to a degree with, sustainable drainage. We could be looking at, again, at that side of things. And also on consumer consumption, the grey water area that is implied in drainage. So I just like a reaction to that. Is there not more that can be done in the drainage area?
Julia, and then John.
I'd just pick up a couple of points. I mean, clearly, in terms of our forthcoming study on surface water drainage, surface water issues, we will be looking at drainage in that respect, because it's a very key element of to what extent surface water is held at any point. And I think the second area is that you were saying about the consumer concerns in this area. Yes, we are very alive to those concerns. We know that type of flooding, when there is inadequate drainage, it does impact very heavily on people, and that's one of the areas that we're certainly planning to address.
John?
Thank you, James. Yeah, I mean, just picking up on that, Trevor, I mean, personally, I can't overemphasize, I think, the importance of maintenance in this whole issue of drainage, and how important ongoing maintenance allowances within regulatory forecasts and so on is as opposed to capital expenditure, and that applies to both road and rail. Going back to the point about public transport, I mean, just on top of, in addition to what Bridget said, I mean, a lot of what we have written in the past has emphasized the importance of public transport and how we see that particularly critical in urban areas to reduce congestion, and that I think our focus on that will continue. It's more difficult, in fact, in rural areas, and coming back to your point about public-private. So, I mean, clearly, from a private perspective, running an extensive rural network of transport is very difficult, and without significant subsidy. So you come straight back into the public role of supporting more public transport if that is to be effective in a rural environment. But overall, it must be right, I think, to continue to emphasize the value and importance of public transport. If there are no other questions, I mean, just to wrap up on today, thank you for the questions which you have posed. And we look forward, particularly over the next 2 or 3 months, to your input to our calls for evidence. This is very much a process of not us sitting in a darkened room, coming to our own perspectives and views on this. We are very dependent on expert views, advice from all quarters. And all of you who've joined us today have that interest in what we're doing. And I hope that you'll feel able to contribute, not only during the period for calls of evidence, but whenever the opportunity arises, if only through the various seminars and conferences that you get involved in, and raising the issue of the importance of this assessment and the role that it has to play in the influence which we all need to have on government in terms of infrastructure, policy and strategy. And of course, as Tony mentioned at the beginning, the importance of short-term delivery and seeing real action on the ground. So thank you all once again. I hope you found it a useful session, and I hope you enjoy reading today's report and getting some value from it. But thank you all very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.